Speak now, or forever hold your peace." The priest's words echoed through the grand cathedral. The chandelier above shimmered like 1,000 tiny stars, casting soft golden light over the room. The air was thick with the scent of fresh roses and expensive perfume. Everyone in the room, hundreds of well-dressed guests, sat in anticipation. Some dabbed at their eyes with tissues, already overwhelmed with emotion. At the altar, Sarah stood in an ivory gown, her hands clasped tightly around a bouquet of white lilies. Beside her, David, the man she was about to marry, looked radiant in his tuxedo. From the outside, it was the perfect love story. But inside Sarah's chest, her heart pounded like a warning drum. She swallowed hard. Something felt wrong. The moment the priest asked, "Does anyone object?" the doors at the back of the church slammed open with a bang loud enough to make everyone jump. A deep voice rang through the hall. "Stop this wedding." Gasps filled the room. Sarah's fingers went numb, and the bouquet slipped from her grasp, the flowers hitting the marble floor with a soft thud. Her worst nightmare had come to life. There, standing in the doorway, was the last person she ever expected to see today, someone who had the power to destroy her entire future with just a few words. And then he spoke. "Sarah, you're about to marry the wrong man." Sarah never believed in love at first sight. But when she met David, everything changed. He was charming, intelligent, and had a smile that could melt ice. From the moment he walked into her life, he swept her off her feet. Romantic dates, surprise gifts, endless compliments. Everyone adored him. Her friends gushed about how lucky she was. Her parents, who had always been critical of her past relationships, instantly approved of David. "He's a good man," her mother had said. "Don't let this one go." And Sarah believed it. But looking back now, there were so many signs she ignored. The tiny red flags that should have made her pause. Like the time he got furious over a text from her old classmate, accusing her of things she hadn't even done. Or how he never liked her spending time alone, always insisting she needed to be with him. And yet, she dismissed it all. After all, love required compromise, right? The first major warning came 2 months before the wedding. Sarah had accidentally stumbled upon David's phone while he was in the shower. His screen lit up with a message from someone named Elle. Her stomach clenched. She wasn't the kind of person who snooped, but curiosity got the best of her. She tapped the message. "I miss you, baby. When will she be out of the picture?" Her blood ran cold. For a moment, the room spun. Was this a joke? Her hands trembled as she scrolled up. More messages. Late-night conversations. Pictures. Plans. David was cheating. The perfect man. The dream fiancé. The one she was about to marry in just weeks. Tears stung her eyes. Her heart screamed at her to confront him. To walk away. To run. But then his voice snapped her out of it. "Hey, babe," David said, walking out of the bathroom, towel around his waist. "What's wrong?" Sarah hesitated. This was the moment she should have left. Should have told him she knew everything. But instead, she did the worst thing possible. She smiled. "Nothing," she whispered, because deep down, she was afraid. Afraid of starting over. Afraid that maybe, just maybe, she was overreacting. Afraid that if she left now, she would never find love again. And so she stayed. But now, standing at the altar, with a voice from her past telling her she was making the biggest mistake of her life, Sarah finally realized. She should have walked away when she had the chance. The entire church was silent, waiting for Sarah's response. David's grip on her hand tightened, his knuckles turning white. "Who are you?" David growled at the man in the doorway. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the man stepped forward. And then she saw his face. Her vision blurred. Oh God, no, it was him, the one person who knew the truth about David. And he was about to expose everything. What secret does this man hold? Why is Sarah about to marry the wrong person? And will she walk away before it's too late? Or will she make the biggest mistake of her life? What would you do if you were Sarah? Comment below. Would you call off the wedding or give David another chance? "Who are you?" David growled, his voice sharp enough to cut through the stunned silence. Sarah couldn't breathe. Her knees felt weak as the man stepped forward, his face finally visible under the golden light of the chandeliers. And then everything made sense. It was Ethan, her ex, the man she once loved, the one she thought she had moved on from, the one who, until this moment, had disappeared from her life without a trace. But why was he here? And why did he just say she was about to marry the wrong man? Gasps rippled through the crowd. David's fingers clenched around Sarah's wrist, so tight it hurt. Answer me, damn it. What the hell are you doing here? Ethan's eyes didn't waver. He wasn't here to ruin her day out of jealousy. No, his expression was too serious, too intense. This wasn't about old feelings. This was about something much, much bigger. He turned to Sarah, ignoring David completely. I need to talk to you. Alone. Now. The entire room held its breath. David let out a cold laugh. Are you out of your mind? You think I'll let you take my wife-to-be aside on our wedding day? Get the hell out. Sarah's hands trembled. She wanted to ignore Ethan. She wanted to go through with the wedding and pretend none of this was happening. But her gut told her something was very, very wrong. Ethan took another step forward. His next words sent a shock wave through the room. Sarah, David isn't who you think he is. Her heartbeat stopped. He's lying to you. He's been lying to you this whole time. A hushed murmur spread among the guests. David's jaw clenched. His grip on Sarah tightened. Get out. Now. But Ethan wasn't done. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. If you don't believe me, then look at this. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears. Her hand was shaking as she took the phone, her eyes scanning the screen. And then, her entire world collapsed. Her legs buckled. She gasped so loudly that the entire church seemed to inhale with her. Because staring back at her were photos and messages that made her blood run ice cold. David, with another woman. On the same night, he had told her he was out of town for business. Kissing her, holding her, whispering sweet nothings in her ear. Sarah's stomach churned. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't just some misunderstanding. This was proof. And it wasn't just one night. The messages went back months. She felt sick. David's voice broke through the chaos. Don't listen to him, Sarah. He's trying to ruin us. But Sarah wasn't listening. Her ears rang. Her eyes burned. Her heart shattered. And for the first time since this nightmare started, she realized something terrifying. She was about to marry a complete stranger. Her wedding was in shambles. The man she loved had betrayed her. The man she once loved had just saved her. Now, she had a choice to make. Would she call off the wedding and walk away? Or would she let fear keep her trapped in a lie? Sarah stood frozen at the altar, her hands gripping Ethan's phone like it was the only thing keeping her upright. David was cheating. The man she was about to marry had lied to her, had betrayed her, had made her look like a fool in front of everyone. The gasps, the murmurs, the shifting of guests in their seats. None of it felt real. Her ears rang. Her breath came in short, uneven gasps. And then, David grabbed her. Sarah, look at me. His voice was low, urgent, almost desperate. Whatever Ethan showed you, it's fake. He's trying to ruin us. Lies. Every word from his mouth felt like poison now. Ethan shook his head, stepping between them. You're a liar, David. His voice was deadly calm. Tell her the truth, or I will. David let out a sharp breath and turned back to Sarah. And that's when she saw it. For the first time, his mask slipped. Not fear, not sadness, rage. His jaw clenched. His eyes darkened. His fingers tightened around her wrist just a little too hard. And Sarah knew. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't afraid of losing her. He was furious that he had been caught. He was dangerous. Her pulse skyrocketed. She needed to get away. Now. But David leaned in, lowering his voice so only she could hear. You don't walk away from me. Her stomach dropped. The man she thought she loved wasn't just a cheater. He was a monster. Sarah's chest tightened. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But how? Hundreds of eyes were on her. The priest stood frozen, not knowing what to do. Her parents looked at her, confused and worried. And David? David wasn't letting go. His grip on her wrist tightened as he leaned in even closer. Don't embarrass yourself, Sarah. Her heart pounded. She had two choices. 1, stay trapped. Marry a man she now feared. 2, run. Right here. Right now. She took a deep breath. And then, she made her choice. Sarah ripped her wrist free from David's grasp and took a step back. A loud gasp filled the church. David's eyes went wide. Sarah! But she didn't let him finish. She turned, and she ran. Down the aisle, past the shocked guests, through the heavy church doors. She ran like her life depended on it. Because deep down, she knew it did. Sarah thought she had escaped. But David wasn't the kind of man to let things go. And as she ran through the streets in her wedding dress, her breath coming in ragged gasps, she heard footsteps behind her. Fast, angry, closing in. David was coming for her. Sarah's wedding dress slapped against her legs as she sprinted down the street, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Her heart pounded like a war drum. The weight of the moment crashed down on her. She had left her own wedding. And worse, David was coming after her. The heavy footsteps behind her grew louder. Closer. She didn't dare look back. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, desperately trying to unlock it. Call someone. Call anyone. But before she could, a strong hand clamped around her wrist. You're not leaving me, Sarah. Her entire body froze. Sarah yanked her arm, trying to break free, but David was too strong. His grip tightened. His face was twisted in something between rage and desperation. You're making a mistake. Let me go, David, she screamed, thrashing against his hold. People on the street turned, staring. A few even slowed down, confused by the sight of a bride struggling against a furious groom. David saw them too, and his grip softened. His expression changed. He forced a smile, though his eyes still burned with fury. Baby, you're just overwhelmed. His voice was suddenly soft, like he was coaxing a child. Come back. Let's talk. No, no, no. Sarah's gut screamed at her. This was a trap. She shook her head, her breathing shaky. I saw the proof, David. I'm not going back. His fingers flexed around her wrist. For a moment, she thought he might snap. But then, a car screeched to a stop beside them. Ethan, he threw open the passenger door. Sarah, get in. Now. David's head whipped toward him, his face twisting with fury. You son of a... Sarah didn't hesitate. With a sudden yank, she ripped her wrist free and dove into Ethan's car, slamming the door behind her. Tires screeched as Ethan floored the gas. David's furious shouts faded into the distance. Sarah slumped against the seat, her chest heaving. She had escaped. For now, the city lights blurred past them. Ethan's hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. Are you okay? Sarah couldn't speak. She just nodded, still trying to process what had just happened. David had chased her. He had grabbed her. And if Ethan hadn't shown up, what would have happened? A cold chill ran down her spine. She turned to Ethan. Where are we going? His jaw tightened. Somewhere safe. He won't find you. Sarah wanted to believe that. She really did. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. As Ethan's car disappeared into the night, David stood in the middle of the street, breathing heavily, fists clenched. And then, slowly, he pulled out his phone, dialed a number, waited. A cold, unfamiliar voice answered. Is it done? David's eyes darkened. No, but it will be soon. He ended the call and smiled. Who did David just call? What does he mean by it will be soon? Would you trust Ethan in Sarah's situation? Comment below. What do you think David's planning? Sarah clutched the seatbelt like a lifeline, her fingers trembling as Ethan drove through the darkened streets. She wasn't safe yet. She could still feel David's grip on her wrist, still hear his voice, dangerous, possessive. She had run away from her wedding. But would she ever truly escape him? Ethan's jaw was tight as he gripped the wheel. We can't go to your apartment. It's the first place he'll look. Sarah shivered. Of course. David had a key. Her stomach turned. How much control had he had over her life this whole time? Ethan's voice snapped her out of it. We're going to my place. You'll be safe there. Sarah hesitated. Trusting Ethan felt dangerous. But trusting David had almost ruined her life. She exhaled. Okay. But deep down, she had a terrible feeling. David stood alone in his luxury suite, his hands pressed against the window as he stared at the city below. He had spent years crafting his perfect image. Charming, successful, the perfect fiancé. And Sarah had humiliated him. She ran. She chose Ethan over him. And that was unacceptable. A knock at the door. David didn't turn as it creaked open. A shadowy figure stepped inside. A man dressed in black, his presence sharp and silent. The same man David had called. David finally turned, his expression deadly calm. "I want her back." The man nodded once. "And if she refuses?" David's smile never reached his eyes. "Then make her regret leaving me." Ethan's apartment was in a quiet neighborhood, far from the wedding chaos. Sarah barely made it inside before her legs gave out. Ethan caught her. "Whoa, I got you." She didn't fight him. She was exhausted. He guided her to the couch, and for the first time in hours, she felt like she could breathe. Ethan knelt in front of her, his eyes searching hers. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I should have told you sooner." Sarah swallowed. "Ow. How did you find out about David?" Ethan exhaled. "Because I knew the woman in those pictures." Sarah's heart stopped. "What?" Ethan nodded, his expression dark. "She wasn't just anyone, Sarah. She was my sister." The room spun. Sarah gripped the couch. "David was with your sister?" Ethan's voice was ice. "And she's missing." Sarah's blood ran cold. Ethan looked her dead in the eye. "Sarah, I think David is dangerous." Her heart thundered. She had thought she had escaped, but the nightmare was just beginning. Sarah wasn't just running from a liar. She was running from a man who might be hiding something far worse. And out there in the darkness, David's man was already closing in. Sarah's breath hitched as Ethan's words sank in. His sister was missing, and David was the last person to be with her. A sickening realization churned in her stomach. This wasn't just about cheating. This wasn't about heartbreak. This was about survival. She wasn't the first, and if she wasn't careful, she wouldn't be the last. Ethan's hands tightened into fists. "Sarah, listen to me. David isn't just a liar. He's dangerous." Sarah swallowed hard. She already knew that. She had felt it when he grabbed her at the church, when his mask slipped, when his voice dripped with control. But hearing it from Ethan made it terrifyingly real. She looked at him. "What happened to your sister?" Ethan's jaw clenched. "She was dating David 2 years ago. Everything seemed perfect until she found out something she wasn't supposed to." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "And then," she whispered. Ethan's throat bobbed. She vanished. A black SUV rolled to a stop outside Ethan's apartment. The street was quiet. A man in a dark suit stepped out, adjusting his gloves. He was calm, patient. He had done this before. His phone buzzed. David's voice came through. "Is she there?" The man stared up at the apartment window. A single light glowed behind the curtains. She was there. He smirked. "It won't take long." David exhaled. "No mistakes." Click. The call ended. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a key. Sarah stood abruptly. "We need to go. Now." Ethan frowned. "Wait, what?" Beep. Both of them froze. The sound came from the front door. Sarah's pulse skyrocketed. Another beep. The electronic lock. Someone was unlocking the door. Sarah grabbed Ethan's arm, her voice barely a whisper. "Someone's here." Ethan's face hardened. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter, his eyes locked on the door. The lock clicked. The door began to open. The door swung open. A man in a sleek black suit stepped inside. No hesitation. No words. Just precision. He shut the door quietly behind him, as if he belonged there. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Ethan didn't move. The knife in his hand glinted under the dim light. The man's gaze landed on them. Cold. Calculated. And then he smiled. "Sarah." Sarah's stomach dropped. "How does he know my name?" Ethan took a slow step forward, muscles tense like a spring. "Who are you?" The man ignored him. His eyes stayed locked on Sarah, studying her, sizing her up. Sarah's skin crawled. Then he spoke again. Calm. Chilling. "David sends his regards." Ethan lunged. The knife slashed through the air, aiming for the man's arm. But the intruder was fast. He sidestepped effortlessly, grabbed Ethan's wrist, twisted. The knife clattered to the floor. Sarah barely had time to scream before the man's other hand shot forward, slamming into Ethan's stomach. Ethan gasped, staggered back. The man didn't stop. One fluid motion, one precise strike. Ethan collapsed to the floor. Sarah's lungs locked. She tried to run, but before she could take a step, a hand gripped her throat. Sarah struggled, kicked, clawed at his fingers. but his grip wasn't tight enough to choke her. No, he was toying with her, showing her that he could take her whenever he wanted. His voice was eerily smooth. "You're making this harder than it has to be." Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs. David sent him. She didn't know if this man was here to take her back or to silence her forever. Tears burned in her eyes. Please." The man leaned in. His breath was ice against her skin. "You belong to David." Sarah shook her head violently. "No." His grip tightened, just enough to make her gasp. "Then you leave him no choice." A click. Sarah's eyes darted down. A knife. A gleaming blade tucked inside his sleeve. He pulled out slowly, deliberately, and pressed it against her ribs. Her body went stiff. "Oh my God." The man tilted his head, studied her reaction, and then he smirked. "Say goodbye, Sarah." Sarah's mind screamed. No, no, this can't be how it ends." The cold steel of the knife pressed harder against Sarah's ribs. Her body tensed, but she refused to scream. She couldn't. If she screamed, it would be over. The man's breath was hot against her ear as he whispered, "You can't run from David. He'll always find you." His words were like a cold gust of wind, chilling her to the bone. Sarah's mind raced. Her pulse roared in her ears. She had to do something. Anything. Her eyes darted to Ethan, still unconscious on the floor, his body motionless. No, she couldn't let him die because of her. Her gaze flickered back to the man, his dark eyes fixed on her. "He's underestimating me." Sarah's lips parted. Her voice was barely a whisper, but sharp. "You don't know David the way I do." The man raised an eyebrow, amused. "Enlighten me," he said, his tone mocking. Sarah's mind scrambled. She had to make him think she was still playing his game. She took a deep breath, trying to sound confident. "David's never been in control. I was always the one holding the strings." The man's expression changed, his grip loosening just slightly. Her chance. Without hesitation, she slammed her knee into his groin. The man's eyes went wide in pain. "You!" Before he could react, Sarah yanked the knife out of his hand and twisted, using his momentary distraction to break free. She stumbled back, chest heaving. "Stay away from me." The man's face twisted with fury. He lunged forward, but Sarah was already scrambling for the door. She couldn't think, couldn't process. She just needed to escape. Ethan came to, his vision blurred, but he could hear the shuffling footsteps and the yell of frustration behind him. He struggled to rise to his feet, but his body felt like lead. He had to act. The man was after Sarah. No, he couldn't let that happen. With all the strength he could muster, Ethan lunged at the man, grabbing his leg and pulling him down. The man stumbled, but he didn't fall. Instead, he turned, his fist slamming into Ethan's face with a sickening crack. Ethan fell back. Pain exploded in his skull, but he forced himself up again, rage burning in his chest. He couldn't lose her. Not after everything. Sarah slammed into the door, her heart racing as she heard the man curse behind her. She ripped it open, but froze when she saw him. A second man. This one had a gun. "Going somewhere?" the man asked, the barrel of the gun aimed directly at her chest. Her heart stopped. This was it. What did she do? She had no weapon, no plan, no way out. But then, a voice, familiar and desperate. "Get down, Ethan." He came from behind, tackling the gunman with a force that sent them both crashing to the ground. Sarah's eyes widened as she scrambled out of the way, heart pounding. She looked up just as Ethan punched the man in the face, sending the gun skidding across the floor. But the fight wasn't over. Another man, the one from earlier, was back on his feet, his hand grabbing the knife Sarah had dropped. Sarah yelled and lunged for the weapon, but the man was faster. He twisted the blade in his hand, ready to strike. Sarah's fingers brushed the knife just as the man raised it. The tension in the room cracked as the two of them fought for control. Ethan was still wrestling with the other attacker, his breaths coming out in labored gasps. Who would win? Would Sarah survive the final clash? Would Ethan make it in time? The knife felt cold and heavy in Sarah's hand. She had only one chance. The man's fingers tightened around the hilt as he raised it high, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous anticipation. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. She knew she had to act fast, but her movements felt slow, as if her body was working against her. This is it. With one swift motion, Sarah ducked, her shoulder slamming into the man's midsection. He grunted in surprise, his grip loosening just enough for her to wrench the knife free. She stabbed. Once. Twice. The man roared in pain, his body shaking violently. The blade went deep, but still, he fought, writhing to stay standing. Her hands were slick with blood, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Behind her, Ethan screamed. Sarah spun, fear clutching her chest. Ethan was on his knees, blood dripping from his mouth. The man he had tackled had recovered and was now on top of him, a fist slamming into his jaw over and over. "No!" Sarah screamed, her voice a desperate plea. With a final cry, she grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and hurled it at the attacker's head. It hit with a sickening crack, sending the man sprawling to the side. Ethan collapsed, his face pale, eyes barely open. Sarah ran to Ethan, pulling him into her arms. She had to move. They had no time to waste. She checked the room quickly, her eyes scanning for a way out. The front door was still open, but the men would be there any second. The window. It was their only chance. Sarah dragged Ethan to the window, her heart racing. "We're almost there, Ethan. Just hang on." His breathing was shallow, his body weak. She could see the life slowly draining from him. No, she wouldn't let him die like this. Not after everything they had been through. She kicked open the window, but just as she was about to climb out, the door slammed open. A third man, a taller, more imposing figure. His eyes were full of hate as he looked at Sarah. Going somewhere, Sarah didn't hesitate. She shoved Ethan through the window first, her hands shaking as she pushed him to safety. Then, with all the strength she had left, she faced the man. "You'll have to kill me first." The man laughed, low and dark. "I'm not interested in killing you, sweetheart. But if you don't get back inside, you'll wish I had." Sarah's mind raced, but she didn't have time to think. She grabbed a broken shard of glass from the floor and held it out in front of her. The man paused, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. "You think you can stop me with that?" Sarah smiled, but it was a smile of pure defiance. "I'll die before I let you take him." The man lunged, but Sarah was ready. With one swift motion, she slashed the glass towards his face. The shard cut deep, and the man screamed, staggering back. He was bleeding now. The man staggered to his feet, blood dripping from the wound, his face twisted with fury. "You're going to regret that." Sarah's heart raced as she took a step back. Ethan was already halfway down the street, but she couldn't leave. Not yet. The man advanced again, but Sarah wasn't backing down. The question now was, could she survive this fight? From outside, Ethan, still bleeding, barely able to stand, saw everything. Sarah, the gun, the man. He knew he had no chance in his condition, but he also knew one thing. He couldn't lose her. With a roar, he ran toward the house, grabbing a brick from the ground. His legs felt like lead, but adrenaline pushed him forward. Sarah saw him coming, her lips parting in shock. "Ethan, no." The man turned at the last second. Ethan swung the brick with everything he had. Crack! The man staggered back, blood gushing from his temple. His gun clattered to the floor. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed the gun. For the first time in this nightmare, Sarah had the upper hand. The gun felt heavy in her hands, her finger resting on the trigger. The man froze, blood dripping down his face as he stared at her. For the first time, he looked unsure. Ethan, panting, stumbled beside her. "Sarah, you don't have to." But Sarah wasn't listening. This was the man David had sent. This was the man who had nearly killed Ethan. Her finger tightened on the trigger. One pull. That was all it would take. The man sneered, despite the situation. "Do it, then. Be like him." Sarah's chest heaved. Be like David. She wasn't like him. She wouldn't be. With a shaky breath, she lowered the gun. But before she could react, the man's smirk widened. Bang! A sharp pain tore through her shoulder as another shot ripped through the room. Sarah's body jerked backward, pain exploding through her. She hit the floor, gasping. Ethan's scream barely reached her ears. Through the pain, she saw it. The doorway. David, holding the smoking gun. "Did you really think I wouldn't come for you?" Sarah's vision blurred, her body weak from blood loss. Ethan was screaming, fighting, but she couldn't move. David took a slow, satisfied step forward. This was it. Sarah lay motionless, her shoulder burning where the bullet had torn through. Blood pooled beneath her, soaking into the wooden floor. Ethan's shouts faded into a blur, her vision flickering in and out. She couldn't move. And then David's voice, low, mocking, terrifying. You always were stubborn, Sarah. But look where that got you. She forced her eyes open just in time to see David kneel beside her, his fingers brushing her cheek like a lover's touch. But his grip tightened, his nails digging into her skin. I gave you a way out, he murmured. You should have taken it. Ethan lunged at him, but David's men were already there, dragging him away, kicking and screaming. Sarah's lips parted, but no sound came out. She wanted to tell Ethan to run, but David just laughed. Don't worry, Ethan. I'm not going to kill her. Sarah's heartbeat slowed. Then why shoot her? Why? I'm just going to remind her who she belongs to. Ethan thrashed in the grip of David's men, his face twisted in rage. If you touch her, David sighed, standing to his full height. Oh, Ethan, you still don't get it, do you? He turned to Sarah, smiling coldly. I let you go once. You ran. You thought you were free. You thought you could escape me. His smile widened as he crouched beside her again. No one escapes me, sweetheart. Sarah felt his breath on her skin, a sick, familiar reminder of the man she once loved and the monster he had become. She gathered what little strength she had left, her fingers twitching toward the gun still lying beside her. David's eyes flicked down, and in an instant, he stepped on her hand. A sharp crack of pain shot through her fingers, forcing a choked scream from her lips. David tilted his head. Oh, did that hurt? Ethan roared, breaking free from one of the men, but another slammed a fist into his stomach, sending him crashing to the floor. Sarah's vision swam. David crouched lower, his voice barely a whisper now. You don't get to leave me, Sarah. Not without consequences. She forced herself to meet his gaze, to show him she wasn't afraid. David only chuckled, standing to his full height. Then he turned to his men. Take Ethan. Make sure he remembers his place. No. Sarah tried to scream, tried to fight, but her body refused to move. The last thing she saw was Ethan being dragged away, his bloodied face twisted in agony. And then, darkness. When Sarah woke up, she was no longer in the rundown house. She was somewhere worse. Her shoulder was bandaged, her body resting on the softest bed she had ever felt. Everything around her was expensive, lavish, gold-trimmed furniture, silk sheets. It would have been beautiful if it wasn't a prison. She sat up slowly, her pulse pounding. The door opened, and David stepped inside. Sarah's body tensed. His smile was calm, controlled. That was what scared her the most. Welcome home, sweetheart. Sarah's fingers dug into the sheets, her mind racing. Ethan. Where was Ethan? And more importantly, how the hell was she going to escape? Will Sarah break free from David's grip? Or is she truly trapped forever? Do you think Sarah can outsmart David? Comment below. How should she escape? Sarah sat frozen on the massive bed, her pulse pounding in her ears. David stood by the door, his face calm, collected, terrifying. I hope you slept well, he said smoothly, stepping inside. It's been a long time since you've been home, hasn't it? Sarah stiffened. This wasn't her home. This was a beautifully decorated hell. Her gaze flickered around the room. There were no windows, no visible locks, just a massive bed, an ornate dresser, and a chandelier that felt more like a cage than a luxury. David tilted his head, watching her like a cat watches a trapped bird. You're thinking of running, he mused. A shame, really. I went through so much trouble to bring you back. Sarah said nothing, but her fingers dug into the sheets. David sighed, stepping closer. You're not going anywhere, sweetheart. And neither is Ethan. Sarah's body went ice cold. Ethan? Where is he? What had David done to him? She swallowed hard. Where is he? David's smirk widened. Safe for now. He sat on the edge of the bed, so close she could smell the expensive cologne she once loved. You see, Sarah, I'm not unreasonable. He leaned in slightly. I'll make you a deal. Her stomach twisted. I don't want your deal. David chuckled, unfazed. You haven't even heard it yet. He leaned forward, his voice a whisper. Stay with me. Be my wife again. Play the role you were meant to play. And in return, he let the words hang in the air, enjoying her silence before finishing. Ethan lives. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. David leaned back, studying her reaction. You don't have to decide now, he said casually. But if you refuse, his smile darkened. Well, accidents happen. Sarah's fingers curled into fists. She wanted to scream, to claw at his face, to rip him apart. But she couldn't. Not yet. She forced herself to breathe, to push down the rage. David wanted her to react emotionally. He wanted to see her break. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, she stared him down, voice steady. I want to see Ethan. David arched an eyebrow, amused. That depends. She forced herself to say it. What do you want? David's smile widened, his fingers brushing a stray strand of her hair. Dinner. Tonight. Just the two of us. Sarah's stomach turned, but she nodded. Fine. David stood, pleased. Good girl. He walked toward the door, pausing only once. Or something nice. Then he was gone. Sarah exhaled shakily, her entire body trembling. She had bought herself a little time. But if she wanted to save Ethan, she needed a plan. And she needed it fast. Sarah's mind raced. David had given her one night. One chance. Could she outsmart him before it was too late? Or was she truly trapped? Sarah stood in front of the massive mirror, staring at the stranger before her. The silk dress David had sent clung to her skin like a curse. Her reflection mocked her. The woman she used to be, the woman David wanted her to become again. But she wasn't that woman anymore, and she never would be again. A soft knock at the door. Then it swung open without waiting for permission. David, dressed in a sharp black suit, smiling like he already owned her. You look stunning, he murmured. Sarah forced herself to remain still, to stay in control. She needed to play along, for now. She needed to see Ethan. David led her down the grand staircase, the mansion eerily silent. The dining room was set for two, lit by golden candlelight, soft music playing in the background. A romantic illusion. A gilded cage. Sarah sat stiffly as David poured her a glass of wine. You're quiet, he noted, taking his seat across from her. Sarah met his gaze. You said I could see Ethan. David's lips curved. And you will. After dinner. She clenched her fists beneath the table. He was stalling. Testing her. She had to be careful. She picked up her fork, forcing herself to eat. David watched her closely, his eyes gleaming with amusement. You used to love nights like this, he mused. Remember Paris? The rooftop dinners. Sarah's stomach churned. That had been before. Before she learned the truth about him. Before she realized who he really was. She didn't respond. David sighed dramatically, sipping his wine. You're still mad, I see. Her grip tightened around the fork. Mad? He had hunted her down, shot her, kidnapped her, and he called it being mad? She forced a small, fake smile. I just don't have much to say. David's eyes darkened. For the first time, a flicker of frustration crossed his face. Sarah hadn't reacted the way he expected, and that bothered him. Good. She was getting to him. David leaned forward, his voice lower now. Let's stop pretending, Sarah. Her chest tightened. Pretending. His fingers drummed against the table. I know you, sweetheart. I know how your mind works. You think you can outplay me. His smile faded. But you can't. Sarah's pulse quickened. Stay calm. Stay unreadable. David tilted his head. You want to see Ethan? Prove to me that you belong here. Her heart stopped. What do you mean? He smirked. Kiss me. A cold shiver crawled down her spine. No. No, no, no. Her nails dug into her palm beneath the table. This was another game. A test of control. If she refused, he would say she was still resisting. And Ethan would pay the price. If she gave in, she would lose a part of herself. David watched her closely, enjoying her hesitation, enjoying the power he thought he had. Enough. Sarah took a slow breath, forcing a small, soft smile. Then she leaned in, and at the last second, she turned her head, pressing a kiss against his cheek instead. David froze. Sarah pulled back, her eyes meeting his defiant. There. Happy. For a moment, David said nothing. Then, slowly he smiled. But his eyes were burning. She had just challenged him, and he wouldn't forget it. Clever. His voice was low. Very clever. He took a sip of wine, his gaze never leaving hers. You'll see Ethan now. David led her through the long hallway, the silence stretching painfully. Sarah's pulse hammered. Was Ethan okay? Had they hurt him? David stopped in front of a heavy door, unlocking it with a slow, deliberate motion. The door creaked open, and there he was. Ethan. His face was bruised, his lips split, but his eyes were fierce. Alive. Sarah rushed forward, but David caught her wrist. Careful, he warned. Don't get too emotional. Sarah yanked free, falling to her knees beside Ethan. Ethan, she whispered. Are you okay? He coughed, offering a pained smile. Been better. David leaned against the doorway, watching the reunion like a satisfied king. See? I keep my word. Sarah turned, glaring. Let him go. David laughed. Oh, Sarah. He shook his head. You're still thinking too small. He stepped inside, crouching beside her. You still don't get it, do you? His voice dropped, dangerously soft. I never planned on letting either of you go. Sarah's blood ran cold. David stood, dusting off his suit. But I'm not heartless. His smirk returned. You have one more chance to make the right decision. Sarah's hands tightened into fists. What decision? David gestured between them. Choose, Sarah. Stay with me, and Ethan lives a comfortable life. Safe. His eyes darkened. Refuse, and I make him disappear. A knife of fear stabbed through her. This wasn't a game anymore. This was real. She had no choice. Or did she? Sarah's breath came fast, shallow. David's smile widened. He thought he had won. But Sarah wasn't done fighting yet. She just had to find the perfect moment to strike. Sarah sat frozen on the cold floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. David's words hung in the air like a death sentence. Stay and Ethan lives. Refuse, and he disappears. David's smirk widened, his hands in his pockets, as he watched her squirm. He thinks I have no choice. But he was wrong. Sarah might be trapped, but she wasn't broken. Not yet. And if she played this right, she never would be. Sarah turned to Ethan, whose bruised face remained eerily calm. Their eyes met, and in that moment, she understood. He wasn't giving up either. A plan. They needed a plan. Fast. Sarah let out a shaky breath, turning back to David. She had to make this believable. Okay, she whispered. I'll stay. David's grin grew victorious. Smart girl. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Sarah forced herself not to flinch. David leaned in, his breath warm against her skin. You'll see, sweetheart. You were always meant to be mine. She swallowed back the bile rising in her throat. Play along. By time. Then, when he least expected it, strike. That night, Sarah lay awake in a massive bed, her mind racing. Ethan was still locked away, but she had seen it. The guard rotations, the security flaws. David thought she was too broken to fight back. But he had made one fatal mistake. He had underestimated her. She carefully slid out of bed, padding toward the dresser. Inside, she found what she needed, a letter opener. Small, sharp, a weapon. She clenched it in her fist, a single thought burning in her mind. Tomorrow, this nightmare ends. Sarah stared at the door, heart pounding. Tomorrow, she would make her move. But would she outsmart David in time? Or would he see through her plan and destroy everything? Sarah gripped the letter opener so tightly her knuckles turned white. This was it. Her one chance to end David's twisted game. Failure wasn't an option. Not with Ethan's life hanging in the balance. She took a deep breath, steadying her racing heart. Then she moved. Sarah waited until David was in his office, where he always felt most powerful. She pushed open the door, stepping inside. David glanced up from his desk, his smirk as arrogant as ever. Couldn't stay away, huh? Sarah forced a small smile, closing the door behind her. Locking it. David raised an eyebrow. Bold move. She walked toward him, keeping her pace calm, controlled. Every step mattered. She had to get close enough. Make him believe she had surrendered. David leaned back, arms crossed. Say it, Sarah. She tilted her head. Say what? His eyes darkened. That you belong to me. Sarah swallowed down her revulsion. Then she leaned in. David's breath hitched, his eyes flaring with victory. And that's when Sarah struck. The letter opener slashed across his arm. David jerked back, cursing. Blood seeped through his sleeve. Sarah didn't stop. She lunged, aiming for his throat. But David was fast. He caught her wrist, twisting it brutally. Sarah gasped in pain, the letter opener clattering to the floor. David's face was a mask of rage. "You little—" Sarah kicked him in the knee. He stumbled, just enough for her to break free. She dived for the weapon, but David was already recovering. Her fingers closed around the handle. She spun, just as the door burst open. David's head snapped up, and then a gunshot. David staggered back, eyes wide. Ethan stood in the doorway, holding a pistol. His hand didn't even shake. "You took everything from us," Ethan said coldly. "Now it's your turn." David collapsed, blood pooling beneath him. Sarah stared, breathless. It was over. Finally, it was over. They ran. Sarah and Ethan raced through the mansion, dodging David's stun guards. The gates loomed ahead, freedom. A car screeched to a stop outside. "Cops!" Sarah staggered to a halt, gasping for air as officers poured in, weapons raised. David's empire was falling. She turned to Ethan, tears in her eyes. They had won. After all the pain, all the suffering, they were finally free. Months later, Sarah stood on a quiet balcony, watching the sunrise. She had survived, but she would never be the same. Some scars, she realized, never fade. Ethan stepped beside her, squeezing her hand. "What now?" he asked. Sarah took a deep breath. "We live." And for the first time in years, she truly believed it. What a journey! What was your favorite moment? Did you see that twist coming? Comment below your thoughts. Like and subscribe for more intense stories.